So good morning, everyone. For those watching us from the Western Hemisphere and those in Europe or Africa or in Asia, good afternoon or good evening. For the Economics Department at the Universidad de Los Andes in Bogota, it's a great pleasure to host this session of DebtCon. The first three editions of DebtCon, which took place in Georgetown and in the Graduate Institute in Geneva, established it as a unique venue for presenting economic, legal, and social science research on sovereign debt-related issues and for discussing the policy implications. In 2020, with the pandemic, we had like 9 sessions in different countries, and this year we will have 3 virtual events that have been planned for DebtCon5, and this is the first one. As I said, it will be hosted at Universidad de Los Andes, and we have 2 sessions today. The second one, let me start with the second one. We'll have Sebastián Álvarez from the Graduate Institute, and Laura Sonderplasman from the University of Copenhagen, and Tim Kehoe from Minnesota, presenting 3 different papers. And this session will be a policy sessions. And we have 2 very distinguished speakers today for these opening sessions. On the one hand, we have Mauricio Cárdenas. Mauricio holds a BA and MA in economics from Universidad de Los Andes and a PhD from the University of California in Berkeley. He's currently a visiting professor at Columbia University, and he's also teaching a very popular course at UniAndes. He's a former finance minister from Colombia from 2012 to 2018. He has also been a Minister of Mines in Colombia, Senior Director for the Latin American Initiative at the Brookings Institute, President of LACEA, and so on and so on. So Mauricio, it's a great pleasure to have you. Thanks for being here. And our second speaker is Andrés Velasco. He's the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He was a member of the G20 Eminent Persons Group. He co-chaired the global panel of the future of the multilateral lending institutions. He was also a presidential candidate in Chile. He was a former finance minister in Chile between 2006 and 2010. He was also president of LACEA, and I read, and I didn't know that, Andres, that you also have 2 novels. So welcome to, it's a great pleasure to have you. So let me briefly tell you how we designed this event. So Mauricio will start by presenting some facts for 15 to 20 minutes. Then Andres will do the same. Then we will react to both presentations and talk among us. And in the final part, we will open the floor for questions. So if you have questions towards the end, you will be able to either raise your hand or write your questions in the QA icon that you will find on the screen. So without further introduction, let me give you the floor, Mauricio, and thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I'm delighted to be in this panel, joining with Andrés Velasco. We've done a number of events lately together, so it's always a pleasure to interact with Andrés. So since this is, and hi to all the other members of this event, I know that there's the next panel is going to be also quite exciting. I thought, since this is the policymakers part, and Andres and I both being former finance minister, that we should focus on the policy issues associated with the debt and the fiscal challenges that Latin America is facing today. Let me start by saying that these are very complex times, and if I were to highlight or actually choose a word that summarizes what's happening now, it's uncertainty. We were living in a world of exacerbated uncertainty. There is uncertainty on a number of fronts, and that is a very challenging situation for policymakers. We have uncertainty regarding commodity prices, which is always an important issue for Latin American countries. We have uncertainty regarding financial markets. And we have a source of uncertainty which is quite local in nature, which is the social unrest. There was a wave of social unrest prior to the pandemic. Some countries, like my own country, Colombia, experienced social unrest and a social explosion during the pandemic. And this is something that has not gone away and is there. And it acts as a force that conditions the policy choices that governments have. So, and thus in the context of uncertainty, we are facing a new crisis. And I'd say in my life as an economist, this is the first time I see two truly global crises back to back. We're just coming out of the COVID crisis. The vaccinations brought hope. But now we have this disruption associated with the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has actually been a very disruptive force for the global economy. Dealing with this new crisis, it's going to be much harder because we're coming out of the COVID crisis with some legacies, with some scarring effects. First of all, we already had high inflation, and that high inflation was a combination of higher commodity prices. Commodity markets were recovering after the shock in 2020, and also because of the increase in aggregate demand. In many countries, including Colombia, for example, there was a significant increase in consumption last year, and that, of course, was part of the reason why prices increased. But we also have, as a legacy effect of COVID, a high level of debt, and that, of course, constrains the fiscal policy options. And not just that, interest rates have been increasing, both domestically and internationally, as a result of the change in monetary policy globally. So this is the context under which we have to deal with this new global crisis. And I would say that the expectation at the beginning of this year, and probably something that is not going to change significantly, is that we'll have much tighter monetary and fiscal policies throughout the world. So this makes the current situation particularly complex. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN has been building since 1990 a broad-based food price indicator. And that index has just reached an all-time high. So we're seeing the highest food prices in more than 30 years. And that, of course, has significant effects on a number of fronts, including inflation. The largest 5 economies in Latin America are seeing the highest inflation jump in 15 years. Brazil has an inflation of over 10%. Chile is close to 9%. Colombia is 8.5%. And the numbers are increasing as we see data coming out. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is how to deal with this situation after essentially a decade and a half of low inflation in the region, of well-anchored inflation expectations. And this is not just the increase in food prices. There is also an element to this that has been reflected in core consumer price inflation. Is something to worry about because inflation expectations are also high. Now, a word of caution is necessary when we talk about inflation, and especially when we think about the policy implications. Inflation surprises tend to improve debt dynamics. Nominal GDP goes up, and policymakers, especially ministries of finance, feel some relief because they see the numbers that are expressed as a share of GDP improve. The debt to GDP ratio goes down. The fiscal deficit as a share of GDP also goes down. But that is a very temporary relief. We should be worried that evidence tells us time and again that these are, short-term effects. In the medium to long-term effects, there appear expenditure pressures. They also, a high inflation environment affects interest rates, affects the ability of governments to issue debt and reduce the financial costs. So this is something to keep in mind, because many times I see ministers of finance say, well, this is not too bad at all, after all, because this is actually giving us some relief in terms of fiscal indicators. That does not mean that improves fiscal sustainability. That's a completely different thing. I think central banks have responded adequately. Some of them have been behind the curve. And when markets think that a bank is behind, or a central bank is behind the curve, it's actually behind the curve. I think that was the case here in Colombia. Some of them, central banks have been much more aggressive. Brazil is a good example, Chile as well. So policy rates have increased by 10 percentage points in Brazil, by nearly 7 percentage points in Chile. Colombia just increased for the third time by 100 basis points its policy rate. So central banks are playing its role, some more aggressive, and as I said, some did it more swiftly than others. But the good result is that the headline inflation has increased significantly more than inflation expectations. So inflation expectations, to a large extent, remain under control. This is an important element. However, output is only beginning to get close to where it was in 2019. The output gap still present in a number of countries, but most importantly, employment is quite below the level we had in 2019. There is a difference of about 2-3% in some countries relative to that level. So monetary policy is being tightened. We have inflation pressures as a result of the invasion in Ukraine, and employment still below the level we had prior to the pandemic. Another important element is that the primary deficit that had increased significantly in 2020, remained relatively high in 2021, is expected to decline in 2022. However, that's yet to be seen depending on how this crisis unfolds. The one aspect that I'm most worried about in this macroeconomic context is the increase in poverty. So poverty, as we all know, increased by about 10 percentage points during the pandemic. It did decline somewhat, but not significantly in 2021. And it's yet to see another increase if with the current levels of inflation that we're seeing now. Since employment generation has not fully recovered, and we're seeing this acceleration in inflation, it is likely that 2022 will be a year of another increase in poverty ratios. There's good evidence in the relation between poverty ratios and inflation. So my concern is that this could trigger another wave of social unrest. And this in a context where Latin America's growth is expected to decelerate significantly this year. Remember that last year, the average growth for the region was GDP weighted, it was 6.8%. And this year, the IMF just released last week's its projections, it's 2.5%. So it's a significant deceleration in growth. Some countries more than others, but quite widespread. I think an important exception is Colombia, by the way, where the increase in terms of trade is so significant because Colombia produces essentially, or exports essentially what Russia does, which is oil, coal, and nickel. We're seeing a significant increase in the terms of trade that is going to explain why Colombia is going to be relatively an outlier in terms of growth this year. But many countries are going to see a significant deceleration in growth. That's Brazil, for example, that will not grow more than 1% this year. Peru, that will grow only 2% this year. Chile, 1.5%. So significant reduction in growth. And this is in some way a reflection of, in some cases, negative terms of trade shock, the withdrawal of fiscal and monetary stimulus, the impact of the increase in interest rates, etc. So the question that I think it's needs to be resolved is, in this context of a negative shock for some countries, increase in poverty resulting mostly from the increase in food, energy prices, low response in terms of employment, what countries can do. And I think the problem here is that the degrees of freedom are much lower now than 2 years ago. The policy options are much more limited. Of course, there is no space to use an expansionist monetary policy. We already have, a completely opposite situation because of the need of controlling and curbing inflation. And on the fiscal side, debt is a constraint. Public debt increased, as I said before, almost 10 percentage points on average in the region as a result of the pandemic. So this naturally generates the question of when does debt become unsafe? What's the limit? And if we look at history, at these levels of debt to GDP ratios in emerging and developing economies, we already had crises in the past. That's the crisis of the late 90s for us in this region with similar levels of debt. And we had another crisis with much lower levels of debt, which was the debt crisis of the 1980s. So there doesn't seem to be much space to deal with this crisis, increasing debt. And also because debt is now a lot more costly. This year, interest payments on public debt are going to increase by about 1% of GDP. So that's a very significant increase. That's also have a negative, that will have a negative impact on fiscal balances. And that, of course, means that debt is now much more costly. Accumulating debt in the past few years was, because of the low interest rates, was not as costly as it is now. So that also constrains the ability of adopting expansionist fiscal policies. The number of countries throughout the world, the emerging and developing world, that are now unable to pay their debts, it's growing. And that should be a concern. The recent example of Sri Lanka is something that we have to keep in mind. So I think there are, and I'll conclude with this, I think there are three big questions that policymakers are asking themselves these days. One is the commodities pass-through question. How much of these increasing prices should be passed through to consumers? Some countries have adopted the policy of limiting the increase in domestic prices by lifting taxes or providing subsidies or providing transfers to households. But that, of course, has fiscal implications. And that also has a problem, which is that that exacerbates the imbalances between global supply and demand. So the increases in prices do not have the impact of reducing that gap. And that, of course, has much more negative effects for low-income countries that have to face higher international prices and don't have the ability to limit the rise of domestic prices. So those countries with limited fiscal space suffer disproportionately the consequences of the efforts of advanced economies to limit domestic price increases. And also, these policies to limit the domestic price increases also constrain the ability of countries to do the energy transition, replace fossil fuels for more clean sources of energy, or also limit the ability of countries to increase their own food production, because prices do not send the right signal. But I'm very skeptical of the ability of allowing the transfer in prices because precisely the social and political polarization that the region is going through right now. The fiscal dimension, I'd say, is the second issue, and because of this high uncertainty that we live on now, I think prudence should be the name of the game. Countries have credible fiscal framework, should have contingency plans to deal with situations that could be worse than what we're seeing now, and policy should be clearly communicated. Monetary, fiscal, people should understand what governments are doing because we don't know what's going to happen next. And also because the financial markets have behaved reasonably well, but that could change. So limiting the borrowing costs for these countries should be a clear goal. And that, of course, to reassure financial markets, these credible fiscal frameworks are fundamental. So my advice will be, the baseline advice for countries is like shift from this exceptional support that was provided during the pandemic to more normal times. We need to normalize fiscal policy, regardless of what's going on, despite these shocks that in some countries are negative. But those countries that do have serious negative shocks, Central America, for example, the Caribbean, that are impacted by the increase in food prices, energy prices, that are going to see a significant reduction in growth, and in some cases a GDP contraction, should use fiscal policy tools if they have the fiscal space. But countries like Colombia again, or Chile, or Brazil, or Peru should use this to rebuild the fiscal buffers. To me, there is no question about that. And the third policy issue I like to address is the debt problem. Some countries are having difficulties in paying their debt, and some countries have the ability to help because, as we all know, last year's issue, $500 billion issue of SDRs, went to the shareholders of the IMF according to their quotas, and some countries do not need those SDRs. So recycling is the key word here. We need to recycle those SDRs. The IMF announced last week that there are going to be two vehicles to do that, to recycle: the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. But they won't be able to recycle more than $100 billion worth of SDRs. So we need to do something else. And here's my proposal on this issue. The countries that have a strong external position, where these SDRs really are not needed, should allow multilateral and regional development banks to borrow those SDRs. And they should be counted as capital, because that will increase the ability of the banks to lend to emerging and developing countries. So my final 2 cents is that we're too worried about the sustainability issue on the public side, but we should also think about the private sector. The World Bank just launched its WDR 2022, focusing on the private debt problem. And we have to remember that private debt also increased significantly during the pandemic, and we need to avoid a private debt crisis. Part of it is making sure that public debt is sustainable. I think that's essential. But also, we have to make sure that the private sector continues to have access to finance, that we improve the insolvency frameworks in many countries, and that we have more transparency so that we know exactly what the situation of banks is, more transparency in revealing information about non-performing loans. We have to avoid the conditions for a debt crisis. And I think that should be the #1 goal right now, because so far we have succeeded in preventing these two global crises to become financial crisis. And I think that will be the risk that we have ahead that we need to avoid. Make sure that this is not another lost decade. And for that, we have to make sure that we keep access to financial markets, and that we don't fall into a generalized debt issue with delinquencies and defaults. So I'll stop here, and more than happy to engage in a conversation afterwards.
Mauricio, thanks very much. Lots of issues on the table. I'm sure we'll discuss many of them towards the end. Just let me remind the audience that we will have a space towards the end of the session for questions and answers. So you can either type your questions on the Q&A icon, or you can raise your hand later on. So let me turn it to Andres. Thanks, Andres, for being here. It's all yours.
Thanks very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Delighted to be joining this virtual stage with Mauricio, and of course with the very eminent colleagues who will be coming on stage in the next panel. Given that the next panel is more technical, Mauricio and I are doing this as a policy discussion, and I'm going to pick up where he left off and focus mostly on the debt situation. Given that this is a debt panel, Mauricio said some important things about debt, but I want to dig a little bit deeper and use my time mostly on that. So let's begin with the beginning. There's some good news and some bad news, as usual. The good news was that during the pandemic, markets were more forgiving with most Latin American countries than one might have expected. The countries that had market access were able to retain their market access. And as a result, a lot of countries mounted pretty robust fiscal responses to the pandemic. I say most countries because some countries never had any market access. I'm thinking of Argentina. And some countries that had market access chose not to use it. Mexico. Allegedly, the president of Mexico does not like credit cards, and as a result, he does not like public debt. Whether that qualifies as a good argument or a bad argument against borrowing, I will remain agnostic on that, but put Argentina and Venezuela to one side, put Mexico to the other, and you find that Brazil, Uruguay, Colombia, Peru, Chile, and a number of others were able to borrow quite a bit. And I think this is good news in the sense that there's been a lot of work on fiscal institutions and fiscal credibility. Not all the work has panned out. There's also been a lot of work on developing local savings, and as a result, a pool of local investors to buy government bonds. I will go back and talk in a bit more detail about that. But the headline has to be that there were enough people willing to buy a lot of government bonds from a number of governments during the pandemic. And this is good news. This is also news. In the previous crisis, the great financial squeeze of 07, 08, 09, I was the finance minister of Chile then. Forgive me if I say this, the only country that really could do counter-cyclical fiscal policy was Chile. This time around, 5 or 6 countries did. So that's forward movement. That's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that, when you borrow, you have to repay. And first of all, you have to recognize that you have more debt. And as Mauricio pointed out, the average increase in public debt in Latin America as a result of the pandemic is 10 points. In some cases, like Brazil, this is taking us into, what seems like dangerous terrain. In Brazil, you really have to be careful with debt statistics because there are lots of things that you have to add and subtract to come up with a credible number. But if you say that debt is somewhere between 80 and 90% of GDP, you're not too mistaken. And as a result, 80% of GDP or 90% of GDP begins to get close to the Reinhart-Rogoff often discussed threshold beyond which things get very dicey, both for economic growth and for debt sustainability. But, put Brazil aside for a minute, even countries with, initially very low levels of public debt, Peru and my native Chile among them, we went into the pandemic with 20, 25%, and we're coming out with about 40%. Now, all these numbers are a little bit misleading if you put them in the context of the debates, in the US or the UK or the EU, because what really matters is the capacity to pay, and tax revenue over GDP is much smaller in Latin America than it is in the EU or in the UK. As a result, if you think of the ratio not of outstanding debt to GDP, but the ratio of outstanding debt to tax revenue, these numbers are much larger. So the question that Mauricio asked is a very good question. When is too much debt too much? Should we worry about issues of debt sustainability? Is some country or is the region as a whole in the debt of a new, in danger of a new debt crisis? I think that's a headline. That's a big, big issue. There's no unique one-line answer to that question, but let me mention what I think are the 3 or 4 key elements in coming to a conclusion as to whether we have too much debt, whether the debt is sustainable, and what we can do about it. Let me begin with one obvious observation. The answer to this question must depend crucially on the interest rate on that debt. We all know that in the developed world, prior to COVID and prior to the recent inflationary bout, the big debate was, well, if R is below G, what exactly is the limit to public debt? And some people are arguing there's no limit at all, and even the pessimists were conceding that the limits are much, much looser. In Latin America, R never went that far down. I'm talking about real interest rates here, at least not for sustained periods of time. You've had short periods of negative interest rates. You've had inflationary spikes. You have financial repression in a country like Argentina, but market rates in the Colombias and the Perus and the Chiles of the world have typically been positive. So the R minus G, negative issue did not really arise. But we have to recognize that over the last 6 months, we went from a situation of very low interest rates to a situation of much higher interest rates. A country like Chile, as Mauricio pointed out, has seen the central bank act very, very aggressively and increase interest rates by 6 percentage points, 7 percentage points. That's huge. And there are 2 historical facts that we need to bring to bear, which will be a source of concern. The first historical fact is that in the past, we had debt crises at debt ratios that were lower than these debt ratios that we have today. Mauricio said that. The second thing Mauricio did not say is that every time over the last 50 years that you have had a spike in US interest rates, you've had a debt crisis somewhere in the emerging market world. Not all of those crises were in Latin America, but almost all of those crises were in Latin America. If you begin in the late 70s and run to the present, think of the Volcker spike, think of the many other spikes since. At some point, you had Brazil go up in flames. Other times you had Argentina. Other times you had the whole region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So given that debt ratios are pretty substantial, and given that the historical record is bad, every time you have an interest rate spike, you have a crisis, a mechanical reading of history would suggest that, yes, we are in dangerous terrain. However, there may be a few new elements to consider, and let me just put those on the table as well, because we don't want to simply say, well, by historical standards, this looks awful. Let's put on our seatbelts because the next debt crisis is coming. The good news is that the situation is a little bit more subtle than that. So what has changed? Why might history not repeat itself mechanically? The first one is that Latin America is a bit more Japanese than we used to be. That is to say, once upon a time, all of our public debt was held by, I want to exaggerate here, but I want to make a point. All of our public debt was held by hedge funds in New York. All of it was in dollar. All of it was in the hands of 25-year-old traders who didn't really know that, you speak Spanish in Colombia and Portuguese in Brazil, and therefore at the slightest tremor, at the slightest change in risk appetite, at the slightest change in world conditions, they all ran for the exits. A big structural change in Latin America over the last 20, 25 years is the growth of a massive pool of domestic savings, which is happy to hold its assets in domestic currency. The poster children for this are Brazil and Chile, under very different circumstances. Chile mostly because of the pension reform, we got up to nearly 200 billion in the pockets of pension funds. We've done the stupid thing of withdrawing some of that, but we still have quite a bit left, over 150 billion. In Brazil, because of a number of other reasons, because Brazil does not have the pension structure that Chile does, but also in Peru, in Colombia, etc. We're not quite Japan yet. We don't have the age structure or the 200 and some % of GDP and public debt. But if you talk to asset holders in Brazil or in Chile, they're not, about to hit the exits. There's a lot of home bias. There's a lot of preference for domestic assets. This, of course, does not mean that there's no threshold beyond which they will not flee. Yes, there is. All I'm saying is that the risk tolerance and their home bias is larger. And so this may render Latin American economies a bit more Japanese. There may be, a bit more willingness to stay home. Secondly, currency denomination has changed dramatically. Once upon a time, everything was in dollars. Today, again, for Colombia, for Chile, for Peru, less so, but for Brazil, certainly, it varies from country to country, but more than half of the public debt in some of these countries is in domestic currency, sometimes nominal domestic currency, sometimes index domestic currency. And this is very crucial. This is very crucial, of course, because the central bank cannot be a lender of last resort in dollars, but central banks can be lenders of last resort in domestic currency. And as we learned from the famous words of Mario Draghi, when a central bank president says we will do whatever it takes, and the debt happens to be in one currency, and that central bank president can issue the same currency, that does a lot to stabilize expectations. I'm not suggesting that Brazil or Colombia or Chile are the EU. Not all the debt is in domestic currency, but I think we have increased the degree to which central banks can act as a stabilizing force by hinting that they will act as lenders of last resort. Those are good items. Let me list a couple of the not so good items. One of them is that as interest rates have risen, average maturity has fallen. And in Brazil in particular, if you looked at what happened to maturity of debt during the pandemic, there were ups and downs, so this was not a very clear trend. But at the times that you had spikes in interest rates, government debt managers quite plausibly, and quite reasonably shortened the maturity of debt. But of course, everybody on this call knows, and of course, Tim Kehoe was one of the early and best contributors to this literature, that when there's a lot of public debt and it's a short denomination, the equilibrium is not unique. And you can have self-fulfilling runs, you can have self-fulfilling panics, etc., etc. Yes, maybe the economy will be tied to the good equilibrium by the central bank, but let me emphasize the maybe in that sentence. We economists don't have very good theories of equilibrium selection. We don't have very good theories of when central banks are credible. We know that the EU central bank, the ECB, is credible in these matters. We have very little practical experience on whether the central bank of Brazil or Colombia or Chile would be credible in this role. And of course, an important footnote, most of these central banks, like the ECB, have restrictions on what kinds of public debt they can buy. They can buy in secondary markets, but not in primary markets, et cetera, et cetera. There could be issues there that limit the stabilizing role of central banks in anchoring the economy to the good equilibrium without a run on the public debt. The last thing I want to say on this subject is that runs on short-run public debt, short-term public debt, sorry, are not things that economic theories worry about. They're very serious and practical. The Tesobonos crisis in Mexico in 1994 was exactly this. And the crisis Argentina had a couple of years ago was exactly this. Central Bank of Argentina had a lot of debt. Interest rates went up. The central bank said, oh my God, we're going to save a lot of money by shortening maturities. And they did. They allowed maturities to bunch into one very short period of time. At some point, the Central Bank of Argentina had several tens of billions of dollars coming due within 4 or 5 weeks. And we know the end of the story. That did not prove sustainable. So there is another equilibrium out there. That equilibrium is bad. I don't think we're near that equilibrium, but let's be honest, we don't really have very good theories or a lot of experience in equilibrium selection, in credibility provision by central banks, especially not in Latin America. So, there are more question marks than certainties in this regard. Let me end by saying a couple of things on fiscal income and a couple of things on fiscal rules. If you borrowed a lot during the pandemic, if you have, as Mauricio suggested, growing political unrest, and if you are societies with public goods that are delivered in a sloppy and insufficient way, the big elephant in the room is, why don't you raise more money via taxation? You don't have to borrow, you can tax. And of course, Latin America in this regard is hugely heterogeneous. So what you say about tax burdens is very different depending which two countries, which countries and two groups you're thinking about. On the one hand, the way I like to think about it is this: do a scatter plot, put tax take to GDP ratios on one axis, put GDP per capita on the other, do a scatter plot of nations in the world, 100 and some of them, put in a regression line and ask yourselves, given their GDP per capita, are Latin American countries above the regression line or below the regression line? And the answer more or less is Argentina and Brazil are above the regression line. That is to say, they collect a lot in tax revenue, 35 or more % of GDP, given their level of development. But pretty much every other country in Latin America is substantially below the regression line, with some cases like Mexico being way below the regression line. It is quite hard to understand, at least to me, why it is that a country of Mexico's level of development and sophistication raises 15% of GDP or less in tax revenue. Which leads me to the conclusion that, in Argentina and Brazil, you need tax reform, tax streamlining and all those things that it is so easy to talk about and so difficult to accomplish. But in most other cases of the region, I don't know what Mauricio will say about Colombia, but, in Peru, in Mexico, certainly in Chile, there is room for increasing tax revenue. And I think that's going to be at the top of the agenda. In Chile, certainly it is at the top of the agenda. The new finance minister, who's a very reasonable man, a very capable man, a very experienced man, is working on a tax reform, which he will send to Congress very soon. Let me put on my political hat for 30 seconds. One cause, probably not the only cause, certainly not the most visible cause, but one cause of unrest is the growing perception that the rich in Latin America do not pay their fair share of taxes. And the truth is, that statement is true or untrue depending on who the rich are and what kinds of taxes you're thinking about. A well-to-do dentist or doctor who lives from a salary paid by a private clinic, that dentist or doctor pays at the margin 40%, is doing his fair share or her fair share. But somebody who lives from dividends or interest payments or capital gains is typically able to structure tax liabilities in a way that at the margin that person is, I'm sure, not paying 35 or 40%. So there is a growing perception among the people who worry about these things that we need more equity horizontally. Namely, it cannot be that certain kinds of income arising from capital have way too many loopholes, in the end don't get taxed. And of course, if you're very rich, your income is not labor income, your income is mostly capital income. And as a result, there's an efficiency argument, there's an equity argument, and there's a political argument at stake. So more tax revenue, particularly more tax revenue from taxation of capital, is very much in the cards, and in my view, at least, very desirable. Before I stop, let me just say two things about fiscal rules. I am a big believer in fiscal rules. Chile is, of course, one of the poster children for fiscal rules. And, when I was a minister, in 3 of the 4 years I was at the helm of the Ministry of Finance of Chile, we had fiscal surpluses of 7, 8, and nearly 9% of GDP. And of course, some people would say, how did you do it? And the answer is, we had a very good fiscal rule. We had a very credible fiscal rule. We had a very rigorous fiscal rule, which said when, commodity prices are above trend and when growth is above trend, you save. And we saved, very large amounts of money. So fiscal rules are a very good thing. And I am, I would have even more gray hairs on my head if we hadn't had a fiscal rule when I was finance minister. At the same time, there are two caveats. One caveat, of course, is that fiscal rules are not a panacea. If you have bad politics and weak institutions, the fiscal rule will be thrown out the window very quickly. So, it is not enough simply to say, oh, I have terrible politics and terrible policies, but let me announce a fiscal rule and all will be well. You need the kinds of institutions that Colombia and Chile have to make that fiscal rule credible. And we've had a number of examples in Latin America where fiscal rules were announced with great fanfare and then abandoned, quietly or not so quietly 6 months later. The other thing I want to say is that to make fiscal rules sustainable, and Chile's fiscal rule with some hiccups has been around for 2 decades now, we need to make them somewhat more complex. And this is something I say with hesitation, because the beauty of fiscal rules is that your average taxi driver understands them. When I was a minister, it took me a long time to get voters to understand what it is that we were doing. But in the end, I would use very simple metaphors. We do with the country's finances what you would do with your family finances. If you get a windfall, in any 1 year, you don't spend all of it, you save part of it. And people say, okay, I understand that. At the same time, these fiscal rules typically are not very complicated in the sense that they don't really have escape clauses. They don't really have contingencies for, highly unlikely but highly dramatic situations like the pandemic. And so, people are not saying this, but pretty much every country de facto abandoned the fiscal rules during the pandemic. In Brazil, they did some creative accounting. In Chile, they kind of looked the other way. But the fact is that, the credibility and the usefulness of the fiscal rules has been diminished by the fact that, if there is a pandemic and people are going hungry, not even the biggest of fiscal hawks is going to say, look, you have to stick to the fiscal rule and refrain from cash transfers to poor households, even if that violates the rule. So we know that in the world of mechanism design, the optimal fiscal rule is complicated. We cannot make real life fiscal rules as complicated as they would be in the model, because then taxi drivers would not understand them. We need to find some midpoint. Without some escape clauses, without some contingent triggers, what will happen is that in the future, the pandemic was not the last crisis. I'm sure we will have more. Then whenever there's a crisis, fiscal rules will be abandoned again. And of course, if fiscal rules are abandoned in every crisis, they stop being fiscal rules. So we need to strike a delicate balance between simplicity and flexibility. There are ways of doing that. I will not go into it, but it seems to me that's a very important agenda for research and policy design in Latin America in the near future. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres. Very interesting. I have a few questions, but let me turn it to Mauricio and see whether he has some reactions to Andres's thoughts.
Well, thanks, Mark. I think we have the ingredients of an even more perfect storm. And we should discuss what are the chances of getting into a debt crisis and what to do to stop it. And listening to Andres, if we were to make the list, we have a deceleration in growth in the advanced economies. Chances of a recession in Europe are growing by the day. In the US, the same thing. Growth is going to be lower in China. 2, we have an increase in interest rates. 3, we have a high level of debt to begin with. And in some countries, not all of them, a negative shock to the terms of trade. Those were the conditions that, taken at face value, generated debt crisis in the past. So the question we should be asking ourselves is, well, what to do to avoid that? But that answer has to be provided in the context of a region that has exacerbated social tensions, that has exacerbated political polarization, where it's difficult to make decisions, where it's difficult to avoid, say, running a larger fiscal deficit. It's difficult to start a normalization policy, fiscal policy. It's hard. So how to take unpleasant, uncomfortable, but necessary decisions in these very complex political times? And I think unless we answer that question, we are gearing up towards a disaster, because we could end up with a situation where we have all the problems that we are dealing with today, but another one that could actually have very long-term consequences, as we saw during the 1980s. So this means we need to build the institutions for governments, either on the left or the right, so that they do the right thing. And doing the right thing today is raising taxes in a progressive way and controlling expenditures, basically following the guidelines of a fiscal rule. And I very much agree with Andres that the new fiscal rules, this new generation, which is now the 4th generation of fiscal rules, it's going to be harder to communicate, but it's going to be more effective. And that tension we need to resolve. And I think a combination of looking at the cyclically adjusted fiscal deficit, but also at the level of debt, something that very few countries are doing now, and keeping an eye on both targets, I think is the new type of fiscal rule that could actually help us manage and transition into these very complex situations. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mauricio. Let me use the privilege of being the moderator to ask 2 questions, and then we'll open it for questions from the audience. So the first question I have is, one thing we have not mentioned is that we have in many countries in Latin America a tremendous political fragmentation, which makes reforms on the expenditure and the tax and even the fiscal rule side really hard to push forward. And this, combined with the social unrest that Mauricio mentioned at the beginning, that makes the necessary changes very hard to push. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And the second question is one related to one thing that Andres mentioned, which is that a large part of our debt in several countries in Latin America is now in domestic currency, which is good news, and is held by the pension funds. But the pension funds have been on pressure in Peru, in Chile, and maybe in Colombia. And that might change the possibility of these pension funds of having large amounts of savings invested actually in the government debt. So I'd like to get your reaction on the likelihood of that happening and the possible consequences. And to the audience, remember, you can raise your hand and we'll discuss your questions after the answers by Mauricio and Andres.
I'm happy to take a stab at both of those, and I think, Mark, they're exactly the right questions. On politics, we all know the often cited quote from the Clinton advisor who said, "It's the economy, stupid." I am a big believer in reversing that and saying, in Latin America, it's the politics, stupid. As you pointed out, the big fact of life in the last 5 years, maybe longer, but 5 years particularly in the region, is the decline in the quality of the politics. Let me give you one fact, two facts, or one fact for two countries. Brazil has 44 legal political parties, of which 24 are in the federal parliament. Chile has something like 30 political parties that are legally constituted, of which 22 are in the parliament. De Gaulle said that France was ungovernable because it had 200 kinds of cheese. By analogy, you could argue that no country is governable with 22 or 25 parties in parliament. Latin America is suffering from a very, very serious problem of constitutional design. We are the only region in the world to mix presidentialism with fixed terms of office and directly elected presidents, American style, with highly proportional electoral systems, which stimulate the creation of new parties, the fragmentation of the vote, and of course, the fragmentation of parliaments. And this is the perfect recipe for policy paralysis. You get to office and you can't do anything because you don't have the votes. And it's the perfect recipe also for disenchantment with democracy, because we have typically second round presidential elections. So whoever gets to be president wins the second round with more than 50%. And he or she, the night of the triumph, gives a big speech saying, we have a huge political mandate, we have over 50% of the electorate. And then on Monday morning sends the first bill to Congress and realizes that in Congress, in Parliament, where it matters, he or she does not have 50% of the vote. Castillo has what in Peru? Something like 10%, 8%, I forget now, his party in Parliament. President Boric in Chile, his coalition has less than a third of the lower house. And as a result, people say, we elected these people and they can't do anything. They're not doing anything. The consequence is not only economic, reforms don't get done, it's also political. People are losing faith in democracy, and this is a terribly bad thing. On pensions, very quickly, I've been a candidate for office twice in my life in Chile, and I spent a lot of time in bus stops and markets and plazas and supermarkets and shopping malls talking to people. The degree to which citizens hate the pension system cannot be overstated. And the people who would talk to me are a non-random sample of population. I was a pretty centrist and moderate candidate. So they were talking to me, it's likely that they were pretty centrist and moderate voters. If the centrist and moderate voters hate the pension funds, I hesitate to imagine what non-centrist, non-moderate voters have to say. So the system as it exists is going to end. Okay, I am pretty sure that's the case in Chile. I'm pretty sure that's the case in Peru. Colombia and Mexico may be slightly different, but it's in the cards that you will have big changes. That does not mean, however, that we are going to go back to pay-as-you-go. Okay, first of all, pay-as-you-go, given the demographics of the region, is pretty infeasible. But secondly, the fact that in Peru and in Chile you've been able to make withdrawals from your accounts means that people who didn't think the money was theirs now understand the money is in fact theirs. Okay, so people say in one breath, I hate the current system, but don't touch my money, which is a way of saying change the system, but don't change it too much. Okay, and one of the things that nowadays is making the convention writing a new constitution in Chile very unpopular is that people fear that the convention will try to change the rules of the game and seize their own money. So my short answer to you, Mark, is I don't think those very large savings are going to be seized by the state. But I do think those very large savings will begin to be managed in a different ways. I wouldn't be surprised if you had state managers. I wouldn't be surprised if you had a different, market structure, if you separated the management of the funds from the administration of the accounts. I mean, you could do, the current system is not the only one compatible with individual accounts. You could have lots of other systems, right? You could have notional accounting, look at Scandinavia. So I think we will continue to have a large pool of savings in private hands. but the way those savings are managed, the identity of the managers, and the way the managers are remunerated will almost surely change.
Great, Andres, thanks. Mauricio, you want to add something?
Yeah, let me add just 2 cents on the issue of pensions. When you started talking about pension funds, I thought you were going to talk about the Ontario teachers or the California teachers, because the debt crisis, if it arises, is not going to be like in the 1980s that commercial banks stopped lending these petrodollars that were recycling to Latin America. It's actually investors that have peso-denominated public debt that suddenly can actually leave. They leave as they left in Malaysia, or they can go anywhere. And to me, that's a really high risk. And that's one of the reasons why we need to be very prudent in these circumstances. And being prudent means, in my view, making sure that no government, populists included, derails macroeconomic stability. On pensions, on private pension funds, they're under attack. And I think part of that unsatisfaction that Andres found in the streets in Santiago or anywhere else in Chile, same thing here in Colombia. It's because of the low pensions. People feel that the pensions they're getting for their lifetime savings are too low. And they associate that, of course, with the private pension funds. But that's the result of the contribution rates, and that's the result of the return on those assets. Private pension funds cannot do magic. But in countries where the pay-as-you-go system still exists and provides better pensions, but at the expense of the taxpayer, of course, the temptation to shut up the private pension funds and concentrate on the pay-as-you-go, even if it generates more fiscal problems because of the demographic transition, it's there. It's actually one of the main proposals being debated today in the Colombian elections. And to me, that's enhancing again the risks of a debt crisis, because private pension funds, what do they do with their savings? They essentially buy government paper. And if we have troubles with the international investors, if we have less demand for our government instruments here locally, that of course is the recipe for the thing that we're trying to avoid, a debt crisis.
Thank you, Mauricio. So let's turn it to the audience. I will first go for those that raised the hand. So Sebastian.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you, Andres, for the great intervention. I have a question about a sector that has been not mentioned. It's actually not very mentioned either in the press or in discussion, which is the banking sector. I would like, to know if you can tell a little bit what is, so we know, that debt crisis can come with banking problems. It has been like that in history. And there is not much discussion of what is the situation of the banking sector in Latin America in terms of exposure to potential debt problems or currency risk, and also to shift in market sentiment at a world level. So I wanted to know what's your take on that, and what is the situation on whether there are regional or country disparities in this regard. Thank you.
You want me to take a cut on it? Good.
Yes, please.
And plus, by the way, Mark, there are lots of questions in the chat, so we should pay attention to them. Look, Sebastian, it's great that you put the emphasis here, because we've been talking so much about public debt. We should talk about banks. We should talk about private debt. Of course, there are many interdependencies here. Commercial banks now hold more government debt than before the pandemic. Many banks were forced to buy government debt. And if you look at the asset side of banks, they're more exposed to governments. And also, of course, the deceleration of growth, the lack of employment generation, and the increase in private debt during the pandemic, all those could actually generate the conditions for problems in the banking sector. So what needs to happen there is, well, first of all, it's good that we're focusing on public debt, because that's a very important it's a crucial component there. But also, I think during the pandemic, many financial regulators decided to kind of like ignore and put a veil on non-performing loans. I think we need to make that very transparent. We need to make sure that we see everything that's happening. And we also should make sure that firms that are running into problems are allowed to reschedule, are allowed to refinance, because I think that's what's going to get the economy moving. Otherwise, we're going to start having problems in that front, and effectively we could end up with a destruction of capital. The worst thing that can happen is that firms go into bankruptcy without having been able to restructure their debt. So I think there is a pending job on the financial sector, and especially in the hands of the financial regulators and supervisors.
Thank you, Mauricio. We have lots of questions in the Q&A icon, so I will read a few of them. So I'll start with the one of Thorsten Beck. So there's one question for Andres and one question for Mauricio. For Andres, are you afraid that a populist wave across Latin America will undermine the credibility of fiscal and monetary policy authorities in the region and ultimately result in a rush away from local currencies and lead us back to the 1980s? And for Mauricio, Colombia has built a strong reputation of fiscal prudence. Is this threatened by the upcoming elections?
There are not that many questions, and they're very good ones, so maybe we can take them one at a time. My answer to the question would be, yes, not only am I worried of that, I think to some extent it is happening already. You know, if I think of Peru, or if I think of Chile, two countries which have had very low debt and very credible institutions, you know, we're not in the same place we were 2 or 3 years ago. And the reason why I can assert that so confidently is simply that if you look at country spreads, you know, they've gone up. You know, clearly they've gone up for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of uncertainty out there of the world, so I don't want to claim that all of the increase in spreads is due to domestic changes. And, you know, one would have to do the econometrics carefully to make such an assertion. But a good chunk of that, I think, is in fact domestically related. However, I don't think we're going back to the 1980s. So the second half of the question may be a little bit too pessimistic. And the reason is this, and I want to summarize my point by quoting what a friend of mine I had lunch with a very senior Mexican policymaker the other day. I will not cite him by name, but the quote is good. He said, "The government of Mexico is much worse than I thought. The strength of the central bank is much larger than I thought." That is to say, fairly able and autonomous and high quality institutions, both in the monetary and the fiscal realm, have been able to withstand, you know, not 100%, but to a surprisingly large extent have been able to withstand populist pressures. Peru has had, you know, governments that have lasted for a few weeks. You've had presidents shooting themselves in the head because of corruption. You've had all kinds of scandals. And the Peruvian central bank is an anchor of sanity and stability. And, you know, the president of the central bank is hugely respected. You know, you look at Colombia and you look at Chile, we have pretty good fiscal institutions. Yes, they've been under some pressure, but they're still going strong. So is there a problem? Yes. Is the populist onslaught something that we should worry about? Yes. Does it necessarily mean that we're going back to the 80s? I don't think so.
Thank you, Mauricio.
So Thorsten's question is very specific about Colombia. We're having elections on the 29th of May. There are really two candidates that have an option to become presidents. And they're both, making very populist promises. It's the populism is not the monopoly of the left. So the candidate from the left is talking about essentially universal basic income, half a minimum wage. It's not clear if it's for 100% of the population or 50% of the population, but regardless of that, it's going to be hugely expensive. And then the candidate on the right is saying that workers should be getting an extra bonus, and that workers are underpaid in Colombia, that they should be paid more. So anyway, we're going to see the competition of these populist promises and what's going to happen afterwards. I think at the end of the day, one thing is the campaign, another thing is to govern. Let's hope that following Colombia's tradition, as you mentioned in your question, the Ministry of Finance is seen as the territory of the moderates, the centrists, the technocrats, the pragmatists, also people that have a clear idea that we have to preserve fiscal sustainability, because if we lose that, essentially anything can happen, and we could end up in a much worse situation. So I really hope that that tradition is going to be preserved.
Thank you, Mauricio. Let me take one of Anna Gerpern's questions, which is a question I also had. So let's get both of your reactions on that. And the question is, at what point are the foreign holdings of domestic debt a source of vulnerability? So we had in many countries in Latin America this increase of foreign holdings in domestic debt over the years, which has been good for decreasing the interest rates of domestic debt, but that's also a source of vulnerability.
I think the first cut has to be having foreigners want to buy debt in pesos. It's a good thing. Not an easy thing, mind you. I remember going to Wall Street as a minister and trying to persuade investment banks to help us issue bonds in pesos. And the answer was, how do I explain what a peso is to, the proverbial dentist in Iowa? Then I said, let's issue index pesos. And then they looked at me as though I was a Martian. What the hell is an index peso? And why would anybody in Iowa want them? So yes, it's happened. Of course, it's institutional investors buying them. It's not, the dentists are buying them indirectly, but not directly. So that's forward movement. Is it, an unalloyed good? No, I think Anna's right. There is a risk. And my source of wisdom on this matter, as in many other issues, is the research at the BIS. They've been looking precisely at this. And what they observe is that when you have institutional investors, and in fact, they have a couple of papers about Colombia, holding debt in pesos, and you have a discrete jump in the exchange rate, the institutional investors don't just say, well, bygones are bygones, we have a lot of debt in domestic currency in different parts of the world, the shocks are uncorrelated, so who cares? What typically happens is that they have limits on total losses, and therefore, if they take a discrete hit in a portfolio on Colombian pesos, well, 2 minutes later, they sell a bit of the portfolio in Brazilian reals or in Chilean pesos because they need to lower their exposure or undo their losses. I'm being a little loose here, I'm aware, but you get my point. So you get rid of one kind of vulnerability, but maybe creating another kind of vulnerability, and you might also be creating some potential for contagion. So the bottom line is, should we be happy that more foreigners want to hold domestic currency debt? Yes. Does it come with some potential risks? Like all things in life, the answer is it's good, but it's not perfect, right?
So let me take that question too. When I became finance minister, only 3% of Colombia's domestic peso-denominated public debt was in foreign hands. And when I left the government, it was 25%, actually 26%.
Right.
So I felt very proud about that. I thought it was a great achievement. And they did that not because they liked the finance minister. They did that because we changed the rules, and we changed tax policies that made it prohibitive to buy Colombian debt earlier. So I'm very happy that that happened. I think that gave liquidity to the market, that actually allowed interest rates, long-term interest rates, to fall. That's very good. You know, it's very important for the cost of capital. But I have to say that a caveat is necessary. There's no magic number. I don't know if it's 25 or 28 or 40%, but that comes with a price. And the price is that you have to behave well, because otherwise, I mean, the vulnerabilities are high. You can have a credit run very fast and almost overnight. So it actually makes it more necessary to stick to and adhere to these principles of macroeconomic stability. It really reduces. You have a benefit, you lower the cost of funds, but you have a cost, which is the reduced ability and reduced degrees of freedom in macro policies.
Thank you, Mauricio. There's a related question by Eduardo Cavallo. Let me read it. It says, Andres, you mentioned that one factor providing more resilience to the region than in the past is the larger pool of domestic savings willing to hold domestic assets. And his question is it higher domestic savings, or is it an increase in the willingness of foreign investors to hold domestic assets due, for example, to carry trade considerations? And does it make a difference?
Thank you, and it's great to hear from Eduardo. I have enough gray hair in my head to have been Eduardo's teacher at Harvard many years ago. So he's done very well in his professional career. My congratulations to him. To some extent, this is connected to the earlier question, and Eduardo's right. We have to be a little bit more careful here. It isn't so much that the savings rate of the nation at large has risen. So I think two things have happened. One is that domestic savings is being held in different ways by different institutions. And it's being the fact that we have private pension funds, the fact that money is privately managed, et cetera, does generate a stock of potential domestic funds willing to buy Mauricio's bonds, or what used to be my bonds, or Brazilian bonds. So there is some structural change on the part of domestic investors. But as we just said in response to the previous question, there's also a massive change on the part of foreign investors, because very able ministers like Mauricio created the incentives for the foreign investors, international investors, to hold domestic currency debt. So they've both happened. That's a short answer. Does it make a difference, Eduardo is asking? I think it does. I mean, there's a big empirical literature out there. I'm not an expert in it. Maybe other people in the call are, as to whether the behavior of foreign investors and the behavior of local investors, in the fixed income market is different. My very cursory reading of that academic literature is that yes, there is a difference. There is more tolerance to risk, there is home bias, there is sticky behavior on the part of domestic investors, because they just know the place. And if I am going to cite something which is not the academic literature, but my own experience, during the crisis of 12 years ago, when the world was imploding, it was quite striking the way that Chilean pension funds, Chilean family offices, etc., didn't flee Chile. On the contrary, they fled the United States and came back to Chile. Again, not because the finance minister was such a nice guy, but because they felt they understood the place, they knew what the risks were. And in a moment of a crisis where you don't know what people's balance sheets are really like, you don't know what bad assets are being held, you don't know what connections there may be between institution A and institution B. So contagion is a big concern. Chilean investors, Chilean pension funds, Chilean insurance companies, Chilean family offices said, I have a better sense of what those risks look like in Chile than I do in New York. So I'm getting the hell out of New York and I'm going back to Chile in a crisis situation. It reminds me of the old joke, what is an emerging nation? Well, an emerging nation is one from which you want to emerge in an emergency. by this definition, I guess, at least during that crisis, Chile wasn't an emerging nation anymore. People went there in an emergency as opposed to trying to emerge from it in an emergency. Whether that pattern of behavior will be repeated in future emergencies, I don't know. So yes, Eduardo, I think it does make a difference. And I am happy that we're a bit more Japanese than we used to.
Thank you, Andres. Mauricio, there's a question on SDRs in the chat. I don't know if you want to tackle it since you mentioned the SDRs in your talk.
Sure. Well, the question is about whether this is necessary because some emerging and developing countries already got their share of SDRs. So wasn't that enough? I think that's more or less the sense of the question. So $650 billion of SDRs, 67% of them went to the high income economies, and only 1% to the low income countries. So there is, of course, clear disproportion in terms of the need. The advanced economies probably don't need that. I think we have to commend the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, for having recycled about 100 billion, which is great. I think it's fantastic, and it's going to help, these provisional public goods at the global level, including, the energy transition, the need to reduce emissions, etc. But there's still, more SDRs in the advanced economies that are necessary. So that recycling, I think, needs to continue, and that's what I say, that this pending issue of capitalizing MDBs, regional development banks, is an important issue, and I think we should continue pursuing that, because we're going to need money for many things. I mean, we're going to need money for climate. We're going to need money for preparedness for the next pandemic. We're going to need money to deal with hunger. So I think it's good to know that at least we know where the money is, but we just need to make sure that it works out well.
Thank you, Mauricio. We have several more questions and only 5 minutes left. So let me pose one question to Andres, and maybe then one more for Mauricio, and then the time will be over. So Andres, can you comment on the last question I see in the chat, which is on the international reserve holdings of central banks, which are larger now than relative to the 1980s, and whether this will work as a buffer against the crisis?
I think we have a paradox that we haven't quite resolved, and it is this. Most of the more advanced or less underdeveloped countries in the region, the same ones we've been talking about, and certainly Colombia and Chile, are supposed to be inflation targeting regimes with flexible exchange rates. And our central banks are very proud of the fact that they are inflation targeters and that they float. In the basic account, in the basic model, if you're a clean floater, why the hell do you have reserves? But as we know, probably since the Asian crisis of the late 90s, central banks in East Asia and to some extent also in Latin America have been acquiring a lot of reserves. And I think the answer is twofold. First of all, they want to be able to serve as lenders of last resort, not only in domestic currency, but also in foreign currency. And also, somebody asked about banks and short-term debt. Well, why, to whom would you give those dollars at a pinch? Well, probably to the domestic financial system. So far, so good. What we don't really have conceptual clarity on, at least I don't, maybe there are papers out there that I haven't read, is, what are proper rules for injecting those dollars at a time of stress? And central banks, get contorted into all kinds of funny statements. There is a crisis and they've got some dollars and they're going to sell them. And they write communiques saying, well, we are selling the dollars, but we're not selling the dollars because we want to affect the value of the exchange rate, which is a half-truth. However, we're doing so because we want to, and then they say something which is kind of incomprehensible, right? And so I think they do the right thing, but they don't know how to explain it. And maybe we could do, or they could do an even better thing, which is make sure that those dollars go where the dollars are needed. Because what you are doing at a time of a squeeze is you're providing something which is in high demand and scarce supply. That's foreign currency. But at a time when financial markets are frozen and some of the pipes are not working very well, they're clogged, it matters who gets the dollars, because the market will not automatically get the dollars to who needs them. So the simple expedient of saying I'm going to auction, $200 million every morning at 8 a.m. is not necessarily the best way to do so. I realize that I'm treading on very delicate terrain here, because central bankers get very nervous if you propose anything that sounds more interventionist or more direct than that. But there is a conceptual issue here. And I think there's room for sort of theoretical thinking on the subject, and there's also room for our central banks to come up with a more systematic and more persuasive way of explaining why they do what they do. Namely, they sit on dollars, and at times of stress, they release those dollars. I just wish they had a better rationale for when they release them and how they release them.
Thank you, Andres. We have a great question by Giancarlo Corsetti, and I'll turn it to you, Mauricio. And we have like 2 minutes left, but it's a good question to finish this discussion. So his question is, spillovers and contagion effects are real and often turn a country crisis into a regional turmoil. Are there specific supranational multilateral initiatives, policies, instruments that you would like to see strengthened in the current circumstances to reduce the risk in Latin America?
Yes, I mean, we keep saying that this crisis and the previous one require more multilateralism, more global coordination. And I think that's true, but that has to have a specific and concrete connotation. What is it that we need from the multilateral arena? So my sense is, just to talk about a few of the topics here, is that we need to make sure that we don't follow these policies that against this global crisis and global problems, every country tries to adopt protectionist policies or subsidize food or subsidize energy, because that's just going to compound problems. I think ultimately the solution is in some form of cooperation. Let me illustrate this with an example, which is a topic that I think it's an important topic for Latin America. All our countries are essentially subsidizing fuels at a high cost. Colombia this year that bill is gonna cost about 2% of GDP. So that undermines any effort of fiscal consolidation. But of course, if oil prices stabilize, if there is more, say, production on the part of the OPEC countries, or if there is more release of the oil reserves of the United States, I mean, if there is a mechanism that can actually for some time curb the impact of high oil prices, that of course will be beneficial for our countries. Otherwise, we'll end up just with higher fiscal deficits. So coordination is important. Vaccines, testing. We have not talked about COVID that much today, but just take a look at what's happening in China. Let's look at Shanghai. This problem hasn't gone, and we still need to keep our guard to make sure that we deal with any risk, any shock of that nature. So supranational coordination, multilateralism are all necessary to deal with this new generation of crisis. This is what we're dealing with. It's a very different type of crisis that relative to the ones we used to have in the past.
Well, thank you, Mauricio. Thank you, Andres. Can I say something in 30 seconds or less? About,
yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I agree with everything Mauricio said, but I would add just one very simple and somewhat boring reflection. In the end, contagion is about liquidity. And so the question is, do we have enough sources of overnight liquidity from the world system? Is the global financial safety net strong enough? And there are a million reasons why I think the answer is no. It is fragmented. You have regional arrangements, you have the fund, you have agreements across central banks, but who qualifies to have a deal with the ECB? Who qualifies to have a deal with the Fed? How are those choices made? It's a patchwork, and I think COVID reminded us of how imperfect it is. And of course, at the core of that network is the fund. The fund announced at the outset of the pandemic that the world, the emerging and developing world needed 2 trillion. They said, we have a lending capacity of 1 trillion. And in the end, they lent out 200 billion. So by the fund's own numbers, the fund provided 1/10 of what the world needed. And that's why rich countries spent 15% of GDP in response to the pandemic, and poor countries on average spend 2% of GDP. And that's not a very happy state of affairs.
Okay, thank you, Andres. Thank you, Mauricio. This has been a fascinating talk. Thank you to our audience. Let me just remind you that we will have a recording of this posted soon, and also remind you that in an hour and a half, we will have the second session of this DebtCon5. So thank you, everyone, and see you later.
Let me welcome you to this academic session. So good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. This is the academic session of DebtCon5, Debt and Fiscal Challenges in Latin America, which we're hosting virtually from Universidad de Los Andes. In this session, we're going to have 3 presentations. Sebastián Álvarez, who is a research fellow at the Graduate Institute of Geneva, will go first. Then Laura Sunde-Plausman, she's an associate professor of economics at the University of Copenhagen, will go next. And Timothy Kiho, professor of economics at the University of Minnesota, will do the last presentation. Each presentation will be 25 minutes long, and at the end, we're going to have 50 minutes of Q&A. There's this Q&A option in Zoom, so the audience can use it during the presentations, and at the end, I'll give turns to answer the questions. So, Sebastián, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank you. Thanks, Mark and David and the Universidad de Los Andes for putting together this panel, for having me here. I'm very, very happy to present my work here. So I will be talking about the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, which is a very well-known crisis in Latin America. Is associated with what we know as the lost decade. And I will be talking and putting the focus of the analysis on a sector that has been has not received much attention, which is the banking sector, the domestic banking sector of Latin American countries. I'm going to be looking at how the banking sector in Latin America, specifically in the 2 countries I will be analyzing, which are Mexico and Brazil, internationalized during the period leading to the crisis, and how they intermediated foreign capital with domestic borrowing, and thereby participated in the external the process of the region and of these countries that eventually led to the crisis, and how was their situation when the crisis exploded in terms of risk and vulnerabilities. So, as we know, after the end of Bretton Woods and the oil shock of 1973, huge amount of liquidity flew into the banking system and the euro markets in London. And this money that was deposited in the euro markets started to be recycled mainly by the big international European and US banks operating in London in the forms of credits that were used to finance the developing world. Latin America received a good chunk of this money. It was a region that benefited most of this process, and this led to a lending boom and a borrowing boom in developing countries that eventually culminated with the outbreak of the debt crisis in 1982 with the moratorium of Mexico, and then soon after followed by many other Latin American countries and also developing countries all around the world. So this process happens in a context of increasing, in which the banking sector in general has been internationalizing for a while. In many regards, in terms of opening branches and agencies in the main international financial centers, and getting involved with cross-border international cross-border financial transactions. And this was a process that concerned not only developed countries, and that led then, when the crisis exploded, to a huge exposure of the banking system, of the international banking system, to the debt crisis. But that also happened at the regional level in Latin America. So Latin American banks were not exception. Of course, they were much smaller players than the big international banks of the time, but they got involved in this process as well. And we have the work of Diaz Alejandro, which has shown how Chilean banks intermediating external indebtedness firms of the business groups. But there are also some evidence of scholars that have proved similar process of internationalization in Brazil, and I have worked in the case of Mexico, and it's something that happened at the regional level. And by the time the crisis erupted, indeed, as we know, and it has been shown by many scholars, the debt crisis came not only with defaults in Latin America or reschedulings of external debt, but also with problems in the banking sector in most of the countries, and currency crisis. So it was a complicated financial crisis that the region experienced during the 1980s, got involved all these three different type of crisis, of financial crisis. So what I will be doing now is looking at two specific countries which were the larger international borrowers back at the time, which are Mexico and Brazil, and looking for which also had some problems in the banking sector. In the case of Mexico, the banking system was nationalized soon after the outbreak of the debt crisis. But in Brazil, there seems not to have been so many problems in the banking system. There were a few bankruptcy in the middle of the decade, but the banking system seems to have been more resilient than in many other Latin American countries to the crisis. So what I will be talking about is looking at how the internationalization of Mexican banks and Brazilian banks developed during this period, specifically within the different regulatory frameworks regarding capital controls and capital flows, capital mobility in these two countries, and how they got exposed differently to the crisis when it came. So as we can see in this chart, both Brazilian and Mexican banking system increasingly internationalized in this period. What you see here is the cross-border financial position of banks, so foreign liabilities of the Brazilian banking system, and from Mexico. In Brazil, it started in the late 1960s and increased up to a bit less than 8% of the GDP by 1982. In Mexico, it started a bit later, but it developed much faster and reached higher levels in terms of GDP that in Brazil. What is interesting in these two cases is that when we take a look at the banking system in both countries, they were more or less quite similar in terms of size, in terms of market structure. Both banking systems have been growing for a while during the 1970s. They were crucial to the development of the IC policies of the governments, and they have been also in a process of concentration through mergers and acquisitions. And we can see from the figures here that when it comes to the foreign liabilities composition, we see some differences. We see much more concentration in the case of the Mexican banking system regarding in the 6 largest Mexican banks. The Mexican banking system was essentially private private banking system, which most of them were privately owned institutions, except for Banco Mexicano, Somex, and Banco Internacional, which are majority owned by the Mexican government. In the case of Brazil, it was much of a mixed system. I have to say that I'm excluding here Banco do Brazil, and we can talk about that later, because it has a double status as monetary and commercial bank. That's make it different in terms of the comparison. But in general terms, we're talking about the two larger banking system of Latin America, and these banks were also among the biggest in the region. However, when it comes to how they develop their international activities and the intermediation of international liquidity or international capital with domestic borrowers, they did it differently. And it is the point I want to make. The reason this developed differently in both countries was because the institutional framework for capital mobility were very different. In the case of Brazil, it has been a long tradition of capital controls and regulation of cross-border financial flows, with foreign exchange controls and many different regimes, all through bureaucratic control, all through the post-war period. There were two specific important pieces of regulation that control the inflow and outflow of capital in Brazil. One was this law 4131 that was enacted in 1962 and is still in place in the country, that regulated the euro credits, all the borrowing that Brazilian firms of the Brazilian state did in the international capital market. And with respect to the banking system, there was this resolution 63, which allowed Brazilian banks to borrow overseas to relend this money locally, but setting specific conditions in terms of maturity, in terms of ceilings to the amount and the volume of operations, and in many other aspects. In the case of Mexico, the context was very different. Mexico had also a long tradition of free convertibility and open capital account regime that has been at the base of the period of Desarrollo Estabilizador since the mid-1950s until the 70s, a period of price and foreign exchange stability in Mexico. And this system remained in place in the 70s. Within this system, there was no general regulation or records of the private foreign borrowing activities of the Mexican sector, or nor control or provisions on banks' foreign activities. So the way Mexican banks operated and decided the model of international financial intermediation was in a much more laissez-faire context. So how did Mexicans bank engage in international finance? They did it mainly by the opening of agencies and branches in the United States and London. London was the core, the center of the Euro markets, and the United States was an important destination for the access to dollar liquidity through the wholesale markets. And as you can see in this picture, they opened agencies and branches in these two destinations. Also in other financial centers of the time, mainly in the Caribbean. The 6 largest Mexican banks that we saw before were part of this process. From there, what you'll see here is the balance sheet composition of the agencies and branches of Brazilian banks overseas. From there, what they could do is take money, raise money in the wholesale markets. And when you take a look at the liabilities, virtually all the liability was wholesale funding. It was very short-term funding that was arranged with other banks. And what they were doing with this money is using to fund sovereign loans. So about 80% of the claims of these agencies were international loans to Mexican borrowers. So and this created important risks for these agencies, because they were essentially borrowing very short term in the interbank markets and lending a much longer term in the international credit markets. And this put them in great danger when the crisis erupted. And what we see here is the evolution of the interbank liabilities, which are the bars of these agencies, in Mexican agencies in the US. And what we see how bank acceptances, federal funds evaporated after the outbreak of the crisis. Mexican agencies in the US and also in London had very confronted liquidity problems, and they were only able to reestablish access to liquidity as part of the renegotiation program that was being launched with international creditors, through which international banks committed to keep pre-moratorium levels of interbank banking as part of the huge rescheduling problem that Mexico was negotiating with the international financial community. However, when we take a look at what was the situation of Brazil, the main instrument that Brazilian banks use in order to operate in the international capital market were the so-called Euro credits. So through this resolution 63 that I mentioned before, they could borrow a credit from Brazil, and it was at much longer terms, as you can see in one of these pictures, 8 years. The regulation established the maturity. Normally it changed, but it's always over 2 years. And then they relend this money domestically, but at shorter maturity. So they make a kind of an universal maturity transformation that the one that Mexican banks were doing. But this is only part of the story, it's the most important part. But Brazilian banks, as the Mexican counterpart, they were also expanding or increasing their international network of agencies overseas. Here we can see how also many new agencies were opened in London and in the United States by Brazilian banks during this period as well. But I'm not going to show here a lot of evidence on that, but what is different is the scale of the engagement in terms of the amount of the volume of asset and business that these agencies undertook in these two different places. That was smaller than in Mexico, and also the nature of the activities they developed, because they were much less reliant on wholesale funding and were not necessarily using this money to fund sovereign loans to Brazil. This is, for instance, here we can see in this chart the amount. This is the annual borrowing through this that Brazilian banks were doing from Brazil through this resolution 63 mechanism established by the law. And here is what the foreign agencies were sending to Brazil. So we can see that how less reliant or how less important were the foreign agencies in this model of international financial intermediation in Brazil with respect to Mexico, that was essentially based on these foreign agencies and branches. And we can also see, if we take a look at what happened to the interbank funding and liabilities of these Brazilian agencies after the outbreak of the crisis, we also see that they did not suffer the same as their Mexican counterparts. So here we have the outbreak of the crisis, the crunch of funding of Mexican banks. The bank most affected was Banespa, was kind of following the same model as the Mexican agencies, because they were funding mainly the Sao Paulo states. But in general, there was not the same crunch, and many other, and indeed new banks, new Brazilian banks, enter into the U.S. market during the middle of the crisis, and were able to raise money in the wholesale market, a market that was close to Mexican banks. And also, this is a piece of evidence that we can find, I found in the Bank of England archives, which kind of shows also the the stress or the problems that Mexican and Brazilian banks suffer in the interbank markets in London. So what we can see here is the net position of the agencies. So this is assets minus liabilities as a percentage of total claims in 1982. So the year before the outbreak of the crisis is August 18. The crisis is started in 20, and then in November after the outbreak of the crisis. So if we see before the outbreak of the crisis, we can see the extent of maturity transformation performed by Mexican agents in London. You can see they are net borrowers in the short term. Here we have different maturity bands. They are net borrowers in the short term and they have net claims on the longer term, specifically over 3 years. So we see how they're borrowing short term and lending very long term. We can see how Brazilian banks are much better matched in this regard. So they're not performing the same extent of maturity transformation. And we also see how different the impact of the crisis was. So you can see how the mismatch became much more important for Mexican agencies after the outbreak of the crisis, with the whole liabilities concentrated in much shorter terms. And it did not really affected the Brazilian agencies and branches in the same extent. I have to say here, I am leaving out, I'm not speaking about Banco do Brasil, which was affected. We can talk about that maybe later, but that's kind of a different story. But in terms of the banking sector, commercial banking sector, that's the picture we get. And this shows the different extent to which Brazilian and Mexican banks were leveraging on foreign funding to develop their activities. Interbank debt, interbank liabilities, or interbank debt by Mexican banks was 6 times their capital, and it was also this interbank debt of Mexican banks that by then were state-owned banks because they had been nationalized, were 3 times the international reserves of Banco de Mexico. So it was an important amount of money, and it was all short-term, at less. And the only way they got to stabilize this is as part of this arrangement that I mentioned. In the case of Brazil, we can see that the leverage is lower, and that an important part of the external liability was this Resolution 63 debt, which did not bring the same risk as the interbank debt. Another important problem that Mexican banks suffered during the rescheduling is that the banks had these short-term interbank liabilities that were evaporating, that were draining, creditor banks were withdrawing, at the same time that their assets with Mexico, so the external debt, the loan they have provided to them, were being rescheduled a longer term. So this created a lot of tensions and a lot of stress, a lot of liquidity and solvency problems. And this was not the case for Brazil, because this Resolution 63 debt was being rescheduled along with the other Brazilian external debt. So it did not have the same kind of impact in terms of the balance sheet problems of the banks. And this is showing also the different.
Sebastian, sorry, you have 4 minutes left.
Yeah. Thank you. And this is showing the different exposure of the both banking system to the direct crisis. So a big problem for Mexican banks when the crisis erupted is that their own banks had significant amount of Mexican debt in their balance sheets, and this was external debt with cross default clauses. I mean, there could not be a selective default strategy. Here we can see that the amount of Mexican debt in the hands of Mexican banks was 4.5 times the capital of the banks, of the Mexican creditor banks. In the case of Brazil, you can see it was only 50%. So this is also showing a completely different level of exposure of the two banking systems that may explain why Brazil did not suffer from banking problems after the outbreak of the crisis, where in the case of Mexico, the banking system was nationalized. So just to conclude, I guess I will leave it like that. I guess the point I would like to make is that in the case of Brazil, just to sum up, commercial banks develop a model of international financial intermediation within a very strict regulatory system, but that control for many of the risks that Mexican banks incur within a more flexible or soft regulated regime. So I will end it up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. So Laura, now is your turn.
Me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
And hear me? Great. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Minimize this. All right. Great. Thank you very much for including the paper in the program. This is joint work with Serkan Arslanalp from the IMF, but does not represent IMF views, I'm told, I have to add. So what we're going to be talking about here is sovereign debt repatriation during crises. We're starting here. The kind of starting point of the paper or the project is that relatively little overall is known about the characteristics of who holders of sovereign debt are. And while for individual countries, we may know a lot about that, or for individual episodes, what we're kind of lacking and what we're after is a broader overview and something more resembling stylized facts. So that's partly due to data limitations so far, and that's partly what we're trying to remedy here. It's interesting to know more about the characteristics of sovereign creditors because that directly affects what kind of borrowing options countries have and what bond prices they face, and therefore what they should be doing optimally, how much debt they can hold, and how that changes depending on how these characteristics of the creditors change. That's important for theory. Just to take one example, one fairly standard assumption in these theoretical models of sovereign borrowing is that all debt is held by external risk-neutral investors. Now, if that turns out not to be the case, then many of the conclusions that we draw from these models might not hold. And in fact, countries might be borrowing at different levels, different prices. It's also important for policy if you're interested in, say, stabilizing capital flows and you want to know how the sovereign debt investor base shifts over time in response to different events. And so we want to know more about that. Specifically, what we're doing in this paper is we're using a new data set to study some aspects of this investor base. The focus is going to be on the distinction between external and domestic investors. So we're interested in that split essentially, and then specifically how that changes during different types of crises that many sovereign borrowers find themselves in. If you want to have one question in the back of your minds, which is what we started the project with, it's whether sovereign debt is in fact systematically repatriated during crises. So whether it's the case that foreign lenders tend to leave disproportionately when a borrowing country gets into trouble. Okay, here's the one picture motivation for that. Let me talk you through what this is. This is using the data that we're using in this paper, and I'm going to tell you more about the data, but just one quick overview. What this is the external debt share. So external debt as a percentage of the total. as a function of the years from the start of a given crisis for a couple of different episodes that I've handpicked here. This is Iceland, the banking crisis 2008. This is the Belarusian currency crisis in 2015, Argentina, and its 2001 event, which was many crises at the same time. And down here we have Greece 2012. And so what you see in this graph essentially is that all of these lines are trending down. So over this window, over this event window, approaching the crisis and getting through the crisis, external debt as a share of the total falls. And so we have this repatriation of debt. And we want to know whether that is true more systematically or particular to certain episodes and idiosyncratic. So specifically what we're going to do in this paper then is estimate the effect of a crisis start on a measure of repatriation. And this might sound like not a very big challenge, but our key advantage here is that we have this comprehensive debt data set that has almost all countries included in the global cross-section and a very long time series, more than 3 decades at this point. So essentially it allows us to cover enough crisis episodes. These crises are rare by definition. And so we need a relatively large data set in order to find anything. So that's what we're able to do. It's also nice that we have this consistent debt and creditor definition across this entire panel. So we're comparing apples to apples. That's often difficult in the past. In terms of, it's purely empirical paper. So in terms of the framework, what we're doing is running a fixed effect event study where our regressors, our explanatory variables, are going to be dummies for crisis starts for these different types of crises at a range of horizons. And the outcome is what we're interested in. So our measure of repatriation in the baseline, this is going to be this external debt share that I showed you in the previous graph. And I think that's probably the only thing I'm going to have time for showing you today. But we also have an alternative measure in the paper. So what kinds of crises are we looking at? We're going to take kind of the big 3, sovereign defaults, banking crises, and currency crises. And here we're relying on existing databases from the literature. Okay, preview of what we're going to find. The finding that we're highlighting is that sovereign debt is indeed systematically repatriated during sovereign defaults. So it's the case that these foreign creditors leave disproportionately during sovereign defaults, but that is less clearly the case during the other types of crises. So this seems to be specific to defaults. This is especially true once we're controlling for exchange rate effects that I'm probably not going to have too much time to talk about today, but I wanted to highlight it anyway. Now, having established that, we then want to find out a little bit more about what's driving this. So what aspect of sovereign defaults is it that's associated with repatriation? And there's 2 main things that we find. One is it matters what kind of default the country ends up in. And in particular, we find repatriation in so-called, what I'm calling here hard defaults. So those are the ones where governments just unilaterally stop payments as opposed to trying to renegotiate with creditors before not paying. The second factor that we find matters is the combination of market size and openness. So it turns out to be the case that repatriation is especially strong in relatively large markets, sovereign debt markets, I should say, with low capital controls. We didn't necessarily expect this. There's arguments going in both directions. There's also theories and anecdotal evidence of governments financial repression leading to governments forcing their residents to buy up debt as they approach a crisis. But what we instead find is that this seems to be more likely driven by some free market outcome and just trading in secondary markets. Okay, so let me very briefly mention the literature and where this fits in. It's well established that capital tends to flow out of countries during crises. For subsets of the episodes and countries that we look at, or slightly different measures, so not sovereign debt specific. So we complement that essentially and show that this is true more generally. One paper that's closely related is this one over here. They show that debt is repatriated in the European debt crisis using very different data than ours. And so here is the data that we build on. I'm going to mention this later on when we discuss the data. There's a couple of theories that have something to say about that, have predictions on repatriation. And so we try to test those with our in the paper. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about this data set before moving on to the estimation. It's an extension of my co-author's previous work. We have 180 IMF member countries included, so very few countries that are just not in the data set at all, and using years 1989 through 2020, with a couple gaps at the beginning and at the end at annual frequency. Then the debt that we're including here, this is consistent across all countries. It's going to be general government debt, bonds primarily. It's going to be measured at face value, so we're not including any discounts, maturity won't matter, coupon payments, none of that. And for EU countries, that definition matches the Maastricht definition of debt. In terms of who our creditors are, we're going to define this according to the residency principle. So external creditors are those residing abroad, domestic residing at home, as opposed to according to jurisdiction or market of issuance. And in practice, what we end up having is data on total debt and external holdings, and then we can back out the domestic as a residual and cross-check that with national sources where available. Okay. One important note is we're focusing exclusively on private external creditors here. And so we're not interested in foreign official loans and net those out throughout the paper unless I'm mentioning this explicitly, okay? And especially for emerging markets, these foreign official loans are a large part of their total foreign debt. Okay, so here's just a quick overview of what this looks like in the time series for a group of countries, by country group, I should say. Advanced countries have the highest external debt share, and it's pretty flat, especially over the last 15 years or so. Emerging market countries, that's been trending up, going from nearly 20 to over 30%, and then fairly low for low-income countries. And if you expected the opposite here, this is because this is excluding foreign official loans again. And this is our baseline measure of interest that we're going to be using in our estimation. Okay. On the crisis data, we're using, as I mentioned, existing data sets. For sovereign defaults, we're using this recently, this is updated to 2020 by Tom Onasumuma and Christoph Trevesch. They define as a default a missed payment or restructuring of payments to external private creditors. For banking crises, we're relying on the database by Levin Valencia, where a banking crisis is defined as significant financial stress in the banking system, together with some sort of policy intervention. For currency crises, we're relying on the Frankel-Rose criterion of a large annual depreciation and an increasing one. For advanced countries, we use a chronology instead, but the results are not sensitive to that. All right. Since defaults and currency crises, according to these definitions, often occur in adjacent years, if they start immediately from one year to the next, we're not going to treat that as a separate event, but instead we're going to call that one crisis, because conceptually that's what this corresponds to. And again, we have some sensitivity in the paper showing that that's not too important how exactly we do that. So the kinds of crises that we end up with that we can study here are these. We have a total of 65 defaults, and the vast majority of these are emerging market or low-income countries. Banking crises, somewhat less rare and somewhat less concentrated in emerging markets, but that is predominantly because of 2008, the financial crisis. So the advanced country banking crises that we have in the sample are 50% of those occur in 2008. In terms of currency crises, these are most common, and the ones that did happen in advanced countries here are all relatively early in the sample, many of them associated with the ERM crisis, 92, 93. Okay, that's what I had in terms of data. So now what is it that we estimate? Here is our model. We have our outcome measure in country I year T, regress that on year country fixed effects, and then these dummies, these are our crises dummies. That takes the value 1 if this country I in year T is S years, which goes from -4 to 4, away from a crisis of type K, where this K includes our sovereign defaults, banking crises, and currency crises. And now what we're interested in here is basically these betas, which measure the effect of being this and that far away from that given crisis type. Okay, the advantage of the specification is that it allows us to separate out simultaneously occurring crises, and they often do. So it's not that they happen, often a country ends up in more than one crisis type at the same time, but we want to separately identify the effect of each. Yes, and this is the baseline specification. We also have some controls in the paper, and if I have time at the end, maybe we can talk about that. But this is the baseline. So what I'm going to be showing you in terms of results are these beta estimates along with 90% confidence intervals. Okay, so here are our baseline results. This is showing you for the external debt share, these coefficients by crisis type. So for sovereign defaults, banking crises, currency crises, as a distance from the crisis start. So for example, what we're finding is that you say for two years before a sovereign default, the external debt share tends to be about 10 percentage points above its non-crisis mean. And then falls over that event window back down to the non-crisis baseline. And this drop is significant. So we find a significant decline in the external debt share in the course of sovereign defaults. In other words, we find repatriation of debt. There's also a downward trend for banking crises, but that is not statistically significant. So less clear cut here. And for currency crises, we only find a drop immediately after the onset of the crisis, but generally an upward trend. This is related to exchange rate effects, which I may not have time to talk about today. But so we have an alternative measure in the paper where we control for that. The bottom line from this, in any case, is that we find repatriation after sovereign defaults, but not so much the other two. So what we then want to do next in the paper is look in a little bit more detail at what aspects of sovereign defaults might be driving that. And so we do two things. First, we ask if the nature of the debt restructuring that occurs after default matters for repatriation. The default database that we use categorizes each default according to whether it was a hard default, so a unilateral payment stop, or whether it was either strictly preemptive or weakly preemptive, where the government didn't just stop paying, but instead approached creditors and started renegotiating first. And so we include these different types of restructuring as separate types of default in our regression. So now the sets of crises that we have here are either a weakly preemptive default or a strictly preemptive default or a hard default. And we check, and we're interested in whether these betas now differ. If we do that, here's what we find. We find a significant decline, significant repatriation during these hard defaults, but not during either weakly or strictly preemptive defaults. And so there's some evidence, in other words, that crisis, if you're interested in avoiding repatriation, that crisis management matters. And that these foreign creditors tend to leave disproportionately if it's a default that they're not particularly involved. So from a policy perspective, this might inform some crisis management choices. The second thing that we're interested in is, or that we look at, is the question of whether repatriation is something that occurs just in secondary markets as kind of a free market outcome, or whether it's something that's forced by borrowing governments. There's theories in favor of both and some evidence in favor of both. I've cited some papers here. The one option is that domestic residents value these bonds more highly, especially in crisis times for various reasons, and that they therefore buy them up disproportionately. The alternative is that governments find it desirable to have residents holding the debt and do this via some sort of financial repression. So we try and separate that out. And the way we do that is that we take all our default episodes and categorize them according to whether they occurred in relatively big markets and in relatively open markets. Okay. And then again, include those as distinct types of default in our regression. So now we have large open defaults, or defaults in large and open markets, defaults in large and closed markets, defaults in small open, and defaults in small closed markets. Here's what this looks like.
5 minutes.
Yes, great. Here's what our categorized defaults look like along the openness and size dimension, just to give you an idea. So you'll notice we have very few defaults occurring in small and open markets, quite a few in small closed markets, and then large open. So Greece, the Greek default up here, for example, very large market and very open market. And then for example, Pakistan default in 1999, large market but pretty closed. One note on measurement, both the size of secondary markets and the degree of financial repression are difficult to measure. And so we're making this, these are both compromises. What we're using for size is just the log of real outstanding debt. Alternative measures such as turnover or some other measure of liquidity that wouldn't have been available for large enough of a set of defaults in our sample. And similarly for openness. So ideally what we want to measure here is very specific measures targeted at whether sovereign debt can flow across borders. And absent that, what we've opted for here is this broader measure of capital controls, which hopefully captures some of that idea. Okay. Right. So when we do this, here's what we find. The black line over here is just the average effect that I showed you earlier. The red swath here is the 90% confidence interval for what happens to the external debt share in defaults in large and closed markets. And so you'll see that doesn't move, that doesn't change from the non-crisis baseline, that stays at 0. Whereas all the action is actually in these large and open markets. Sort of, this is the blue swath. So all defaults that happen there, they are the ones driving this repatriation finding. And so we take this as evidence in favor of it being more of a free market, not driven by financial repression phenomenon. Okay. That is the majority of what I wanted to talk to you about. I have a fair amount on robustness that I can get into, but maybe we'll leave that for later in case there are questions. A brief note on what we're doing. So I have an alternative repatriation measure that accounts for exchange rate effects. We include some omitted variables, and we also look at the effects of repatriation, whether that has an effect on GDP or whether repatriation occurs cyclically and not just during crisis. Okay. But for the discussion, we'll discuss this later. So let me conclude for now. What we've done in this paper is ask what are the characteristics of some sovereign debt holders, especially during crises. And what we're showing are some new empirical facts on the composition and the dynamics of the sovereign debt investor base. The key finding that we're emphasizing is that we find repatriation during sovereign defaults, but not during other types of very common crises. And we identify some important factors driving this, namely the nature of debt restructuring and large markets plus openness as a facilitating factor. And so we see this as important findings that can inform future theories of sovereign borrowing, crises, and their resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So, Tim, your turn. I think you're muted, Tim.
No, I'm not. Buenas tardes, es un honor para mí poder presentar en esta sesión con participantes tan interesantes. It's a great honor for me to be able to present in this session with such interesting presenters. My work's going to be related to both of Sebastian and Laura's comments. And I'm very inspired by the excellent policy session that we had this morning. If I can be permitted to be a bit bold, one of the big problems that Latin America has is that in many countries and at many points in time, the ministers of finance are not as sensible and knowledgeable about economics as Mauricio and Andres. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a paper that I wrote with Carlos Esquivel, who was a grad student here at the University of Minnesota. He's now an assistant professor at Rutgers University, and a friend of mine for many years, Juan Pablo Nicolini, who was a professor for 20 years. He still does it part-time at Torquato di Tella, and he was even the rector there for 8 years. He's now a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And since 2010, we've been working on a project that finally resulted in a book. And I'm gonna mention some things related to this in a few minutes. And what we did is we assembled teams from 11 Latin American countries. Some of the choice of countries was driven by how big the countries are. Another part was driven by how easy it was for us to assemble the teams. We would really like to extend this work in the near future to economies, first in the Americas, in Central America or the Caribbean, countries like Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic. Okay, but right now we have these 11 countries, 10 of them in South America and 1, Mexico, in North America. We kind of jumped the middle. The paper I'm talking about is the concluding chapter of the book. Besides the 11 countries and discussions by distinguished economists of each of the histories of those countries, we have a kind of overview by Fernando Alvarez, Lars Hansen, Tom Sargent. We have an introductory chapter, and this is I'm going to talk about a bit, where Juan Pablo, Tom, and I developed the kind of framework we use for understanding the economic histories of these countries. I'm going to talk specifically about the concluding chapter by Carlos Esquivel, Juan Pablo, and me. So this book is available. I have these links here. Anyone writes to me, I'll be glad to send them to you. But you know, you can find these very, very quickly on Google. what's interesting is all the budget accounting that I'm going to talk about today, you can do it yourself for any country that you can get the data you need. That can be found in this in these downloadable data appendices that are available on this website of the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago, which supported our work. One quick note, the chapter on Colombia here was written by David Perez Reina, the moderator of this session. So I hope he's going to be not so strict with me on time. That's a joke, David. I'll get this done on time. And Daniel Osario of the Banco de la República. Every one of the chapters had a conference in the country where we invited prominent former policymakers and economic historians, macroeconomists to discuss what we were doing. We had a very nice conference in Bogota, sponsored by the Universidad de Los Andes and the Banco de la República. Altogether, 60 economists were involved in the discussions, writing chapters, writing and helping us put this thing together. Okay, so Latin America, as we know, was a tragedy. If you'd asked your typical economist in 1960, and so that's going to be a person older than any of us. I'm kind of getting a little bit on the old side, but in 1960, I was just starting primary school, and I wouldn't have had an answer. But if you had wondered what area of the less developed world has the most promise for the future, you would not have said East Asia. The East Asian boom hadn't taken off at that time. At that point in time, Mexico and Brazil were two of the fastest growing countries in the world. By the end of the 60s, things weren't looking as good. And then in the 70s and 80s, they became a disaster. We just have some quotes from the popular literature here. Eduardo Galeano, in his the Uruguayan, in his very famous book, which he offers an analysis, one we don't happen to share, of why things were beginning to go so wrong in Latin America. He says development is a trip with more shipwrecks than navigators. That's what's interesting about this history, is every possible policy mistake you could imagine was tried in at least one of the countries, and some of them several times. You know, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it, and that's true here. We also try to answer the famous question, which is the second sentence in Mario Vargas Llosa, the famous Peruvian novelist and later, of course, politician. He asks, in exactly what moment, that he asked literally in the book, en qué momento se había jodido el Perú? But we're going to ask, in exactly what moment did Latin America screw itself? Well, for every country, the moment's a little bit different, but it's always in the 70s and early 1980s. Okay, our hypothesis that we started out with, and we believed more than ever when we were done, is that in Latin American countries, the crises that we're gonna look at coincided with economic downturns. in some cases, what Ed Prescott and I, in our book, Great Depressions of the 20th Century, characterized as Great Depressions. Now, what's interesting is the specific symptoms of each crisis could be very different. We had high inflation rates, hyperinflation in some countries, not in others. Balance of payments crises followed by big devaluations, banking crisis, default on government debt, confiscation of deposits related to some of the stuff that Sebastian was talking about. But our hypothesis is that every one of these crises were the product of poorly formulated or poorly implemented fiscal policies, sometimes accompanied by bad luck on the external economy side. Now, this is very related with what Mauricio and Andres were talking about this morning. This could be coming up again. When we finished this book in 1917, 1918, prospects for most of the countries in Latin America, and of course there were exceptions, most principally Venezuela, but also to some extent Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia were not getting everything right. But you know, the other 7 countries were. Now everybody's in danger again. Now, of course, the title of the paper I wrote with my friends Carlos and Juan Pablo were Lessons, and there's lots of lessons. And that's why I hope that I'm inspiring you to take a look at the book. You can look at the online version for free. The book itself is 670 odd pages, and the price is only, it's beautifully produced by University of Minnesota Press. The price is only $20, so you can go out and buy it. So I'm going to have 2 lessons I'm going to discuss today. I don't have that much time. One of them are that monetary and fiscal policies to combat inflation are not necessarily contractionary for the real economy. I think too many Latin American economists in general, have studied in the United States where we focus too much on lessons learned in the United States. Anti-inflation policies are often called contractionary policies because we have some simple Keynesian model in our head. And actually, when we look at Latin American experience, we don't see that. We see it sometimes, not others. I'm going to show you a couple pictures in a minute. Without accurate budget accounting, primary deficit, and this is something for all economists to remember, you really have to check if the primary deficit is a good measure of the fiscal stance of the government. For all the countries we look at, during some periods of time, there were all sorts of government spendings and income that were done off the books. Okay, so let me just show you these pictures very quickly. They're from 2 charts in the paper with Carlos and Juan Pablo. What we looked at are episodes of stabilization of inflation. And for the different countries, I put the United States here. Of course, we didn't have hyperinflation. The worst year for inflation for the United States was 1980, about 13% in the CPI. These were the countries in our sample that had hyperinflations. And usually for hyperinflation, we'd think of inflation more than 500% per year. But we had a bunch of charts where we used months because we didn't want it. We wanted to have things on comparable scales. You put Bolivia in with 1984 equal to about 13,000%. It makes everything else look small. But this is going to be real GDP. And what we notice is that for some countries, and here I think Brazil, Argentina stand out. For Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, they were in bad. The hyperinflation was a symptom of all kinds of problems, and just starting stabilization didn't really solve it. It did with a lag, though, in all the countries. But what we see is that some countries, when, for example, Argentina started its convertibility plan, Esquema de Convertibilidad, in 1990, they started growing right away. Brazil with its Real plan, okay? In the cases of chronic inflation, which was inflation in averaging like about 30% per year for a period of time, in all of our countries, starting stabilization, things improved. I'm just going to note, for people who've been paying too much attention here, the big news today is that the United States Federal Reserve System Board of Governors raised the federal funds rate, the target interest rate, by 0.5% today. And you know what? The stock market jumped up. And it's part of the same thing. When you're worried about inflation, suppressing inflation can be good news. Okay, so now, and I'm really happy that I get to follow Sebastian, I'm going to talk for a little bit about how we use, and this is what our study consists of. We use this government budget accounting to come up with a narrative of what happened in countries in this period we're looking at. And why did we start in 1960? Not because interesting policies necessarily started in 1960s. Latin American countries have been making mistakes in countries for years. That's when good data starts. And what's good for us too is we get in 10 years of fairly good economic history before the disasters start. So Mexico, let me just mention this before I start. Sebastian already mentioned this. Mexico suspended payments on its external debt to US and UK banks in August 1982. And that's started what we call the lost decade. So let's see what happened there. Mexico had large primary deficits. Okay. I'm going to teach a course on this at the Barcelona School of Economics. We just changed the name of that this year to Barcelona School of Economics. You probably remember it being called the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics for its first 12 years. I'm not going to do that now, so I'm not going to go through all of the details of this. This is basically Sargent's budget accounting that he used to discuss economic policy in the United States in the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, modified to include things like local currency denominated debt, foreign currency denominated debt, and a residual because of bad government budget accountings in the countries, which I've mentioned for all the countries at some point in time was the problem. That here is this term X, which I'm going to take, we're going to be a residual that we calculate in order to have the government borrowing requirement equal to what the total deficit, including interest payments or debt defaults, do. We do some algebra, and we come up with tables that look like this. So we have sources of funds and obligations for those funds. Every year, I'm putting 1982 in the middle of this picture. And we see that we can see why 1982 was a chaotic year. The government had a total, if you want to call it, deficit equal to 22% of GDP, 22.2% of GDP. The primary deficit had been high leading up to it, and it was still positive that year. But you notice this thing called the transfer was 13.6% of GDP. Now we know what was in the transfer. And I'm going to tell you stories about that. But there's no book. We have word of mouth and memories and things like that to tell us. These are not things that have been recorded. It's interesting. I was working in Mexico for the summers of 1981 and 1982 with my classmate and co-author, Jaime Cerro Puche, who was later the Minister of Trade and Minister. It makes it sound foreign. The Mexicans use American terms. He was Secretary of Trade and Secretary of Finance in Mexico. But at the time, we were working with Leopoldo Solis, who was the Director of Research at the Banco de Mexico. And so I saw a lot of what was going on in the summer of 1982 firsthand. I spent 3 summers there, and I learned a lot about these things. So talking about this brings back memories. There was a series. What's that?
You have 5 minutes left. 5 minutes.
I'm moving ahead. So all my praise of you won't get me another 2 minutes, David. Anyway, here are things we see. There's huge increases in that table, huge increases in public and private debt denominated in dollars. There's big increase in seniorage in 82. But none of this was important compared to the increase in transfers. Now, what's transfers? I've already mentioned it's ways the government spends or collects revenues out of the scrutiny of the Congress, the press, and the general public. Big part of that in Mexico was a bailout of the banking system in August. In Bolivia, a country that where I was involved looking at the numbers, it was poorly accounted for losses and sometimes profits by public firms. In almost all these countries, there were losses of national development banks. And in all of the countries at some point, there were multiple exchange rates. And these are things where the data is just totally unavailable for who got to exchange pesos for dollars or dollars for pesos and at what rate. It's a bit of a mess. For countries with hyperinflation, and that's not Colombia or Mexico, of course, we have the Olivera-Tanzi effect, that different timing of spending and collecting taxes, there are the ones netted from the other at the end of the year, but sometimes it's really expensive expenditures at the beginning and cheap tax collecting at the end, or in Brazil, even the reverse effect. They call it the reverse Tanzi effect. Institutional reforms can eliminate transfers. In Mexico, Mexican government after the 1990s became much better for accounting. I know while my friends and co-authors Carlos Gustavo Machicado and Jose Perez Cajillas were finishing up writing the Bolivia chapter here. I became an expert on Bolivia. The IMF had a mission there that asked the government to have comprehensive government accounts. And there are still countries that haven't, but here are some that do. Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay. Okay, here's like what multiple exchange rates look like. There was the devaluation in early '82, but then in August, all of a sudden we have 3 exchange rates. And the highest exchange rates in pesos for dollars is about 3 times the lowest one. Who got to exchange what? Some private agents were allowed, were forced to have low peso to dollar exchange rates. And these were the big taxes. They were predominantly the Mexican middle class who had moved their money to the then private banks to what were called Mex dollar accounts. They were accounts in pesos, but indexed to the dollar. The Mexican government promoted the use of these accounts throughout 1982. And in the end of August, they just stole all that money. More than half the life savings, including my friend Jaime Serra's parents. Why do I say middle class? The rich got their money out of the country well before this, and the poor people didn't have enough savings. And then there were implicit subsidies. Mexican companies that were friends of the government got to buy dollars cheap and turn in their pesos at a very good rate. So what we do in this chapter is talk about what lessons we learned about what government behavior should be. And it's not a right-wing agenda. We look at countries like Norway or Denmark, where Laura lives now. They spend a lot more, have a lot more comprehensive social programs, but they have sound fiscal policies. They tax enough to pay for those things. We do need to secure government, and Andres and Mauricio talked about this morning. We need to protect government debt by trying to denominate as much as possible in local currencies. This is not relevant for that many countries anymore, but when you actually have a closed financial system and you open it up, we learn that opening too fast can be a mistake. And then you need, and this is related to my points about transfers, some countries in Latin America still needs better monitoring and control of spending by independent government institutions. Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Thanks a lot, Tim. And thanks also to Laura and Sebastian for these great presentations. So now we're open to questions. Eduardo, I thought you had written a question. I don't know if you want to go ahead and ask it.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. Yes, I put a question on the chat, Laura, and was kind enough to send me the answer, and also I got an answer from Sebastian. So that question I don't have the one I put on the chat, I don't have, but I do have 2 additional questions, one for Laura and one for Tim. First, thank you very much for excellent presentations. I mean, the 3 of them were really very, very good. Thank you very much for that. For Laura, I have a hard time understanding what you really call by repatriation, because this is debt that is held, your external debt is debt that is held by foreign investors. So basically your measure of what you call repatriation is when that debt changes hands from a foreign investor to a domestic investor. But I'm not sure that is repatriation in the sense of, you know, a domestic investor repatriating some asset from abroad. So I would like to get a little bit more clarification from you on that. And for Tim, the question I have for you is, it's very interesting, the evidence you show on sort of the expansionary effects of stabilizations, no? And of course, that goes against the common wisdom based on the Phillips curve and all that, you know, I mean, stabilizations are costly in terms of output and so on. Based on all of what you have studied in this tremendous volume that you have put together on the monetary and fiscal history of Latin America, why do you think that that's the case? If you could give a little bit more of the intuition on that. Thank you very much to everybody.
Okay, great. Yeah, let me start answering that. So your question was essentially how we define repatriation or what we mean by the term. And I think you got that exactly right. So we're talking about what we want to capture is a move from, so a foreigner holding a bond and that then being bought by a domestic agent or ending up in the hands of a domestic agent instead, or domestic resident. And so we're not interested in where in the world the domestic resident holds that debt, because what we think from a theory perspective, what should be interesting is the ultimate holder of the debt and not exactly where the debt is located, essentially. So we want to know the identity, assuming that they have different characteristics of external versus domestic holders and not necessarily the domestic person bringing the assets home. So that's exactly right. And maybe, can I also briefly, the question that you had on the chat, can I maybe elaborate on that a little bit? I didn't, I would have had to type for too much. You were asking, it's a relevant question that you asked. So you were asking if we are lumping in, so if part of our external debt is denominated, if we're mixing the currencies essentially, and the answer is that yes, we are. So part of our foreign held debt is going to be denominated in local currencies and part in foreign currencies. And so that's potentially relevant because there's exchange rate movements, especially during crises. Right, and that's something that we address in the paper. The short answer is that this exchange rate depreciation that we see during crises actually would work against repatriation. So we're somewhat happy ignoring that. But it would be nice to properly account for this, and the data is just not available. So for a shorter part of the sample, we do have the currency split, but only the more recent past where there haven't been that many crises.
Good. So let me answer your question quickly, Eduardo. The brief answer is I don't know. Here's the thing. Periods of financial crisis are periods of declining total factor productivity and declining real GDP per capita. If we could make a really tight connection between those two, and we're going to keep doing it, we're going to keep trying. But we had ideas like, you know, anecdotal things or things you see when you're in countries with high inflation rates, and you see, well, if you're a small firm, you have to close a little bit longer at lunch because you have to take whatever the morning receipts were to the bank to protect it from inflation in the afternoon. The costs like that would be associated with bigger losses in productivity for small firms than larger firms, and we don't really see that. Our general story, though, is that the people who run the firms, either big firms or small firms, are more concerned with rent seeking And as I've explained, in these periods of chaos in the country, this transfer term tends to explode, and people are concerned with rent seeking rather than productive uses of inputs and effective delivery of their product to the market. And that's the problem. It makes everybody take the eye off the economic ball and play a messy game of politics to try to be the person who benefits and doesn't lose from the things like dual exchange rates. It's as good an answer as I can give you now, and we've tried. You come up with a better answer, and I want to hear it.
So there was a question for Laura, but I see you're typing it. So unless you want to do rather answer it out loud.
I can also do it in words. So the question was why the residential identity of the asset holder should matter. Example being, if a Mexican bond held by a US fund in Boston is sold to a Mexican fund in New York, how does that change anything in Mexico? And the answer is that I guess it's an open question whether that changes anything, but there's theories that would say that the Mexican government would be less likely to default against the Mexican fund. And so to that extent, it might matter for their borrowing choices and yeah, exactly, who the holder is.
Sebastian, I have a question for you. So it seems the result, like what you showed, it seems that like a stricter regulation in Brazil caused, that there wasn't such a big banking crisis in Mexico. But then again, in Mexico, there seems to be more intermediation, right? Like banks seem to be bigger. So I guess my question is related like to this cost-benefit analysis. Like if Mexico hadn't like maybe a less lenient regulation or some regulation at all, I mean, at what point would it have been worth it to have like strict regulation?
Worth in what sense? In terms of creating less instability? I'm not sure. Let me say, I guess the way I would answer that question is to say, I'm not trying to make the point that the capital control system in Brazil was at the base of the security. It was, of course, an important component. It was indeed at the base, but the fact that this system was in place in a way forced banks to move in the direction the system or the regulation set for doing that this way. It doesn't mean that the government was doing any purpose. In fact, towards the end of the outbreak of the crisis, the Brazilian government, in needs of dollars, flexibilized many of these measures and pushed the banks to go overseas because that was a way of getting the dollars from their own banks that other banks wouldn't lend, right? So at the same time, we have this extremely heavy bureaucratic system that the Brazilians have in place did not prevent the banking system from internationalizing. And that's kind of the arguments I try to make. In a way, you have bigger or much higher integration of the Brazilian banking system than the Mexican one, and safer one, So the counterfactual of what could have been done in Mexico if there was, any kind of regulation is a difficult question. I guess in this absence of controls, the way Mexican banks found in order to get involved in this or do this international financial intermediation, and that's another important factor. The reason Mexican banks got involved into this process is because they were under heavy pressure from competition from foreign banks that were allowed to lend. They were able to lend much cheaper to Mexican borrowings than what they could lend from domestic sources. So that was what pushed Mexican banks to go overseas, and they did it in this very risky way. That's what I can say.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian.
You're welcome.
And Tim, I have one final question for you. Like in Latin America, we're seeing countries again with increasing fiscal deficits, and we kind of know the answer, right? Either decrease government spending or increase tax revenue. And it seems that instead of having like concrete answers for that, we're coming with these very crazy ideas in most countries, especially the ones where we have like presidential elections this year. And so like it might be like a more policy question, like how can we give the message that we need to decrease these fiscal deficits if we want to avoid like another lost decade?
Yeah. During the pandemic, David, as you know, I mean, we had to shut things down, and it makes sense then to be running a deficit. Now the pandemic's not over, but the economies are starting to recover, and there's these big debates about how much we should stimulate. Well, you know, in the United States and Europe, it seems that we can stimulate quite a bit, and it might lead to inflation, but it doesn't lead to the sovereign debt being at risk. In Latin America, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. So if you look at the spreads on Latin American debt, except for Chile's not quite so bad, but the spreads on those have really jumped. And that's tough. I mean, I sympathize with the Latin American politicians who want to try to smooth consumption during periods of low output. But you can't afford to do it without raising taxes. And that's not popular. That's not a populist message. So I'm afraid. I wish I had a better message for you, David.
On the upside, beers are going to be cheaper for you next time you come here.
Yes.
Well, I guess that's all the time we have for today. I wanted to thank again Sebastian, Laura, and the team for those great presentations and all the people that connected. Hopefully next time we could do it in person, and we do it like it should be done. After the talk, we go and grab some drinks maybe and continue talking in a more relaxed fashion. But for the moment, we need to say goodbye. So thanks again for attending this DebtCon5.
Yeah. And thank you very much, David and Mark, for organizing this. And both of the sessions were a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.